Welcome to Session 3, Using Rubrics to Support Teaching and Learning. In this first session, we'll focus on how to use the rubrics we developed in Session 2 to identify trends in student performance. We'll then use these trends in the next session to inform instructional decisions and provide feedback to students. As we discussed in Session 1, the SNAP NGSS performance assessments are designed to be educative, and so are the rubrics. Using these rubrics to center student learning means using them to consider how every student is making progress and what their strengths and needs might be to ensure that no students are left behind in science. And this begins with using the rubrics to make sense of student data we collected and making informed instructional decisions for students based on the trends we identify in their strengths and needs. Paul Bambrick-Santoyo explains the importance of assessment as part of the teaching and learning cycle when he says effective instruction is not about whether we taught it, it's about whether the students learned it. Assessments are not the end of the teaching and learning process, they're the starting point. And we use SNAP multidimensional rubrics to help us find evidence of what students have learned and what they're struggling to demonstrate in relation to the intended outcomes. These data help us then to decide how to fine-tune the teaching and learning process. When we view teaching and learning in this way, we start to see our performance assessments as the starting point rather than the end point. At SNAP, we see the primary uses of rubrics as a means to provide meaningful information about students to guide the 3D teaching and learning. They're used by teachers and students to reflect on progress and to identify areas of students' strengths, as well as areas that need additional attention. This design of the assessment as an educative tool guided the design of rubrics that easily translate student work into feedback that can be used by teachers and students to improve learning outcomes. However, we also acknowledge that most teachers need to evaluate students and provide grades. We'll discuss how to use rubrics for this purpose in the second half of this session. As teachers of NGSS, we need to make the use of assessment data part of the continuous cycle of improving and differentiating our instructional practices. You begun the process in Course 2 and Course 3 by collecting student data from your pilot. Since the assessment has already been revised using student data, we're now going to shift our focus to using analysis of student work from the improved assessment to guide instructional moves and provide feedback to students. Now we use your drafted rubric to analyze student data and to identify any learning trends we see. In Session 3B, we'll then use your expertise to consider what are some possible reasons for these learning trends. And we use these reasons to make really targeted instructional decisions to address some of these issues and improve student learning. And last but not least, we also want to make sure we're using the rubrics to provide quality feedback to students so they can revise their work and reflect on their own progress. We'll take you through this process in Session 3. Keep in mind that the trends we gather about student performance can be used to make informed instructional decisions and provide feedback for students. And it doesn't necessarily need to go in that particular order. You may choose to provide feedback to students first, before your next instructional step. This is completely up to you and what works best for your students and scope and sequences. To walk you through this process, we'll continue using the DEAR task. In this video, we'll identify trends in student performance using your rubrics. We do this process in 3 steps. First, identifying the culminating question for the task. Next, looking for trends in the strengths and needs for each dimension in the rubric. And lastly, checking these trends against other questions to see if they apply throughout the assessment. And we'll walk you through this whole process with a DEAR task, asking you to pause throughout to practice in a DEAR task practice document. At the end of this video, you'll then have an opportunity to do the whole sequence with your own rubric and student work. We'll also provide you with a workspace for instructions to do the work with your own assessment. We start by identifying the culminating question for the task because responses to this question often provide a good representation of students' strengths and needs across the whole assessment. And this allows us to work with just one set of data instead of having to look in depth at all responses for every question in the assessment. To help us identify the culminating question for the task, we want to look across all the questions in the task and consider, in which question do students resolve the phenomenon-driven question? and which question best elicits evidence of the 3 dimensions you're trying to measure. Since you've already practiced identifying the culminating question in Course 3, we went ahead and analyzed all the questions in the DEAR task for you. We selected question 4 as our culminating question for the DEAR task because this is where students answer the phenomenon-driven question presented at the beginning of the task: what's causing the change in the deer population in Colorado? As you can see by the color coding here, this question also allows us to see evidence of each of the 3 dimensions we're trying to assess in this task. Now on to step 2, looking for trends in strengths and needs for each dimension. This is when we'll start using the rubric to help us analyze student work for trends in strengths and needs. To get us started, it helps to just look at the range of scores across one dimension at a time in the rubric. This will give us a quick snapshot of how students are performing within each of the 3 dimensions. For example, in question 4 of the DEAR task, the first dimension of the rubric is the cross-cutting concept of cause and effect. Note that for the sake of space on this slide, we've selected just 4 students that represent the range of student responses we saw across the whole class set. When you do this step, you'll be looking across the scores of all your students. So based on student scores out of a total of 2 points, how are students performing with the cross-cutting concept? Well, at quick glance, we can see that most of the students are able to use cause and effect relationships to make a claim about the most likely cause for the change in number of deer. However, when we look across the student scores for the science and engineering practice of analyzing and interpreting data, we see that a majority of students are not scoring as well here. Most students are not getting the possible 1 point. And the same can be seen for the disciplinary core idea about interdependent relationships in ecosystems. Students have the potential to earn 3 possible points for this DCI, but only student B is showing complete evidence, and the others are not showing any evidence of this at all in their explanation. Based on the student performance within each dimension, we then ask ourselves, what are the students doing well within this dimension? And what are students struggling with in this dimension? To identify these trends in strengths and needs, we have to look back at what our expectations were for students within each dimension. An easy place to look for this is in the description of performance in the rubric. When we identify these trends, it's also helpful to see approximately how many of your students are showing this trend and add a descriptor into your trend. This information will help you later on in the process as you decide which type of feedback and instructional decisions to select and which groups of students to implement them with. Let's start with the cross-cutting concept to describe our trends. In the previous step, we saw that students were providing ample evidence for the cross-cutting concept, with most students earning a 2 out of 2 points. So we labeled this trend as a strength in student performance. Based on these 2-point scores in the description of performance in the right-hand column of the rubric here, it seems that most students were able to make a relevant claim about the likely cause for the change in number of deer, which included a description of the population decreasing and a relevant cause, such as a lack of food. We used the word most in our trend because about 75% of our students were showing this kind of evidence. When we looked at the science and engineering practice row of the rubric, however, approximately 75% of our students received a 0 out of 1. Thus, the trend we see here is a clear need. Based on the 0-point scores and the description of performance in the right-hand column of the rubric, it seems that most students were not citing one of the relevant figures that provides evidence to explain the decrease in deer population, either figure 3 or figure 5. Again, we use the word most in our trend because about 75% of students were showing this kind of evidence. Now you'll practice identifying a strength or a need for the DCI in the DEAR task. Start by looking at the DCI row of the rubric for question 4 in the task. Analyze student performance for this dimension. What are they doing well, or what are they struggling with? Use this analysis to identify a trend in strengths or needs. In your trend, include a description of approximately how many students are demonstrating each trend. You'll do this practice in the Session 3 materials labeled DEAR Task Practice. So go ahead and open that now and begin work on Step 2 of this document. Pause now. We hope that you noticed that a majority of students were showing a distinct need when it came to the DCI of interdependent relationships and ecosystems. Based on these scores and the description of performance in the right-hand column here, it's clear that even when students are citing data, they aren't using reasoning about ecosystems to connect the pieces of data in a way that explain the change in the deer population. Most students are not including reasoning that non-living factors like rain affect living factors like sagebrush. And most students are not describing how living populations like elk and deer compete with each other. And don't use reasoning to connect the elk, deer, and grasses data. Again, we use the word most in our trend because about 75% of our students were showing this kind of evidence. While the analysis of student work brought out some very clear trends in students' strengths and needs, it's important to also check whether these trends are consistent across the assessment, or if there are other questions in which students are able to show better evidence of the dimensions. This can really help us pinpoint what the exact trend in needs is, and also help us hypothesize of what some of the reasons are behind the trends. So for each trend in needs, we want to consider, did students have the same need for another question that measures the same dimension? Were they able to use the dimension in another question, but they're struggling to incorporate the dimensions together in the culminating question? In the case of the deer task, question 3 offers an excellent opportunity to check our trends. This question also measures the same 3 dimensions in a different way and was intended as scaffolding for question 4. Let's start with the SEP. When we look at the range in student scores, we see that on this rubric, students are often scoring well for the SEP. A majority of students are able to describe a relevant pattern from at least one figure in Part A of their data table. Remember that the trend we identified for the science and engineering practice in question 4 was actually a student need. In question 4, most students were not citing one of the relevant figures, figure 3 or figure 5, that provided the evidence needed to explain the decrease in the deer population. Interestingly, when we looked at trends in student responses for question 3, which measures the same SEP, we saw a slightly different story. When students were asked to analyze each of the figures individually and describe patterns in the table, most students were indeed able to describe at least one relevant pattern. Okay, so now it's your turn again. Practice checking the trend in the DCI from question 4 against student work from question 3. Look at the DCI row of the rubric for question 3. Describe the trends you see and consider, did students have the same needs in question 3 as in question 4? Were they able to use the DCI in question 3, but they're struggling to incorporate the dimensions together in question 4? Pause now to return to your session 3 workspace for the deer task. When we look across the range in scores for the DCI, we see that even in question 3, most students are not able to describe any of the possible interactions in ecosystems that would explain the patterns seen in the figures. The need from question 3 remains relatively consistent to what we saw in question 4. Across the assessment, students are still really struggling to describe how changes in living and non-living parts of the ecosystem explain the patterns they're seeing in the figures in order to support a claim about the change in deer population. If you don't have rubrics for other questions that assess the same dimensions, you can also use a scaffolding question that you know assesses the same dimension in order to check your trends. For scaffolding questions, you can just do a quick scan through the student responses to see if questions are showing the same trend as in the culminating question. For example, question 1 of the deer task is a scaffolding question that doesn't explicitly assess the DCI, but can give you some information about the SEP. You can at least see whether students are able to analyze graphs and pull out a relevant pattern. As you can see in these representative samples of student work, students are able to describe a relevant pattern from a graph. However, in later questions like 3 and 4, when they're asked to connect with reasoning about the DCI, this seems to be where students are struggling. So it's possible that bringing multiple dimensions together is challenging students, or using the DCI for reasoning to connect pieces of evidence together might be what's challenging students. Based on our analysis across the question, we identified 2 main trends and needs for a majority of students. In terms of the SEP, we found out from questions 1 and 3 that most students are able to describe relevant patterns from each of the figures. But in question 4, they're not citing the relevant figures to support their claim for the decrease in deer population. And in terms of the DCI, most students' reasoning doesn't describe how changes in living and non-living parts of the ecosystem explain the patterns seen in the figures. And this trend was seen across the entire assessment. These kinds of trends will help inform the whole class feedback we provide students and what our instructional next steps should be for the majority of our students. Now it's time to try this with your own student work and rubric. At the end of this video, open your workspace, which will provide all of the instructions you'll need to do this for your own assessment. Once you finish using your rubric to identify trends in student performance for your own assessment, you can begin session 3B, using trends to make informed instructional decisions.